Good evening and welcome to our viewers here in Denmark, and especially good evening and welcome to you, Grace Blakeley, who is with us from Great Britain. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
We're very delighted that you'll take your time and talk to us. One of my friends said the other night after the protest against the oligarchs in football, he said, well, finally we've got something good out of the British working class consciousness. And then another one said, no, actually, we also have a new great intellectual socialist who wrote the book Stolen, and he was referring to you. So you have a fan base here in Denmark.
That is a real honor to be mentioned among such esteemed company. Thank you.
You're an economist and you call yourself a democratic socialist, and we'll return to what that exactly means for you, and the author of two books, Stolen from 2019, which I think is just a major piece of work coming out of the intellectual left for the last 10 years. And then the smaller book, The Corona Crash, from last year. And you're a writer at the Tribune magazine. And I want to recommend also your podcast, A World to Win. And there's a question that you frequently ask your guests that I've been looking forward to asking you, which is, how did you become a socialist?
Oh, wow. You've turned that one around on me, haven't you? It's good to know that you do actually listen to the podcast. Yeah, I mean, well, I've been on the left from really when I was very, very young. My grandfather was a communist and a shop steward in one of the big unions in the UK, the TGWU, back in the day. So there was a kind of family connection there. So I was always kind of, vaguely sympathetic towards the left, but didn't really start identifying as a socialist until I started at university. Started kind of, reading Marxist political economy, broader kind of leftist political economy as well. And then I really got involved in the Corbyn campaign and the Corbyn movement after I left university. So I graduated in 2014 and finished my master's in 2015. So after that point, I then went to kind of work for a think tank and became much more involved in the Corbyn movement, I suppose. And it was at that point that I really started thinking much more about what it meant to be a democratic socialist, the kinds of policies and methods of organizing that really need to underpin that. So yeah, I think it's been a kind of steady journey from quite a young age up until this point in time, when obviously the socialist movement in the UK and around the world is dealing with both a series of election losses and the impact of a global pandemic, and we're really thinking, where do we go next?
It's funny because we're chronically in love with all progressive movements here at this newspaper. This means that we're also very often very disappointed. And we've been talking a lot about what actually came out of the momentum movement, because at a time it was such an interesting moment that you had a protest movement within the old Labour Party, and the Social Democrats were going down all over Europe, and the Labour Party seemed revitalized at that time. So you're one of the products of the momentum movement. We're two different generations. I'm a lot older than you are, and I was born in 1974, and I was always disappointed with the left because, I grew up with the expectations that were shaped by the golden age of capitalism, what the French call le temps glorieux. So I just feel that my life has been right turn, losing all the time. And I'm curious about you, because you're born in 92, and you write a little bit about it in the book in Stolen, where you said those in education when the financial crisis hit. For those, the spell of capitalist realism was broken. And it seems to me that you didn't grow up with the disappointment of the old left, but more into a reality where you didn't expect a lot from the left. And then came this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the kind of the only real contact and connection I had with that old left was through my family and through my grandfather, who himself was, very kind of skeptical by the end of his life about the achievements that the left had made. So, when I was kind of going into university, there wasn't really much of a left to speak of. I mean, so after 2011, when you'd had Occupy and the student movement in the UK, you'd started to get a bigger coalition of activists coming together to resist austerity. And of course, that resistance to austerity was a really big and foundational part of what ultimately became the Corbyn movement. But there wasn't really a kind of coherent left to speak of in the way that there is today. And that was really a result of, several decades of neoliberalism. It was the assault on the unions that I write about in the book, undertaken by Thatcher and actually, not reversed by Blair. It is to do with the kind of, I suppose, the construction of particular kinds of neoliberal subjects as well, the kinds of people who conceive of themselves in very individualistic terms, very unlikely to join social movements, quite unlikely to go out and protest. And obviously the kind of spell of what Mark Fisher termed capitalist realism, which is this idea that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Obviously, after the kind of triumphalist moments of 89, and the globalization era that came after that, this whole idea the world is flat, capitalism is going to lift the rest of the world out of poverty. The left was very much sidelined, and there was a divide on the left between social democrats. You saw this in the UK, a divide between socialists who thought, right, well, capitalism is here. There's no possibility of a kind of revolutionary conjuncture. The revolutionary subject is gone, so we have to accept this and adapt. And, they often tended to go down the kind of social democratic route. And those socialists who just tried to hang on, basically, for as long as possible. I think a great example of this is Ralph Miliband's book, Socialism for a Skeptical Age, which was written in the 90s. He was basically saying, trying to keep this flame of hope alive. And, politicians like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell did the same sort of thing. And then, of course, when that huge crisis that had been building from around the 1980s took place in 2007, suddenly we realized we could peek behind the curtain and see actually how fragile the ideology of capitalist realism was, and actually the kind of basic material foundations of this structure were as well. What perhaps we didn't count on was the strength of class solidarity among the elite, basically, and how they would successfully manage to use that moment to basically resist any threats from the left and really line up with various different kinds of xenophobic and reactionary movements to try and push back against the newly resurgent left. But yeah, I think 2007, 2008 was certainly a kind of a formative, a defining moment for our generation. And actually this pandemic that we're living through right now is going to be another one.
And for me, 2007, 2008 was so traumatic because you had these 3 or 4 months where you thought, well, neoliberalism is going down. And I remember there was an essay in the Financial Times and it said it's the end of market fundamentalism. And, we'd all been writing about the crisis of capitalism. They would develop contradictions. And actually, no one really knew what to do at that time. There were no programs. There were no real radical policies. There were no visions for transformation of the economy. I had some hopes for Gordon Brown at a certain period of the crisis and for Barack Obama as well. I felt they said the right things at the right time. I don't know a lot about Gordon Brown, but I always thought that he was more of a socialist than Tony Blair at least was. But then nothing came out of it. And it just seemed that they were a lot stronger after that because they said, the neoliberals, they survived this crisis. But now it seems that we're in a very different moment. And your book, I think, is part of that because that is a book that suggests specific policies. And I think it's a difficult moment because on the one hand, you had these leftist leaders like Corbyn and Sanders actually losing. But on the other hand, you see Biden doing things that were unthinkable for a moderate like Biden 10 years ago, siding with the workers against Amazon, fighting for a minimum global corporate tax, and even a wealth tax that you mentioned in Stone, which was unthinkable for the moderates. So things have changed. I think Piketty's books have contributed to that as well. How do you see the moment that we're in right now?
I think what's interesting about both this moment and actually the period after the financial crisis is it challenges the traditional understanding of what it means to be on the left, in my opinion. I think for a very long time, and this is, I think, an outgrowth of neoliberalism itself, we have been accustomed to the idea that to be on the left means supporting a bigger state, basically, and being on the right means supporting a smaller state. And actually, both of those things are profoundly untrue, because during the neoliberal era, certain areas of the state were cut extensively, but other areas were expanded dramatically. And you see this with a move away from a kind of a state that exists to provide various forms of social security towards a state that exists to regulate social life. So regulation under neoliberalism just expands hugely, often in support of capital accumulation. We couldn't really have had the boom in the finance sector that we had were it not for changes in regulation that took place up to 2007. So what you really had was a state that was geared towards supporting the interests of capital, and actually within that particular segment of capital as well, the kind of more internationalized, financialized segment. And then on the left, which we really bought into this argument that actually what it meant to be on the left, to be progressive, was to say the state should be bigger, we should be doing more stuff, spending more on public services, and coming to rescue the banks when they're in trouble. It's really astonishing that was seen as a kind of left position at the time. The left has been saying, the Labour Party wanted to nationalise the banks only in the post-war period, as a way of kind of transforming like the distribution, the allocation of capital. And then it suddenly became a left position to say, oh, we'll very briefly nationalize the banks and then immediately privatize them again without imposing any concessions on them or any demands on them whatsoever. Gordon Brown, of course, did come up with really quite significantly on his own the idea that the banks should have to be nationalized, because of course at the time during the financial crisis everyone thought it was just a liquidity crisis, they just need more loans from the central banks, we just need to pump liquidity into the system. Gordon Brown realized the banks were insolvent, they weren't just illiquid. He said that means that we need to basically buy them up and find a way of separating the good assets from the bad assets. And different states did that in different ways, but that really came back to Gordon Brown. But of course, that wasn't something that was done primarily in the interest of workers. It was something that was done to safeguard the capitalist world system. I think Jeff Mann, who wrote a book about Keynes, has a really good understanding as to what this kind of attitude is. It's the kind of Keynesian attitude, which is we have to save capitalism in order to save civilization, because when capitalism collapses, it brings civilization down with it. So the left kind of got pigeonholed into that very specific argument, which is actually more to do with protecting the interests of capital and making sure that workers had enough to be able to purchase the things that capitalists were producing, to be able to invest in housing, to be able to meet their kind of basic needs, and in the neoliberal era provide for their own forms of private insurance as opposed to social insurance. But it was never really a kind of transformative image as to what society could look like in a very different world, and I think that's kind of coming back to bite us now, because after decades of kind of rightly resisting austerity, basically because we were saying on the left in the UK, austerity is bad because we want a bigger state, not because it was harming these particular groups of people or it was in the interest of this class, but just because a bigger state is better. Now Biden comes in and says that we're giving you a bigger state, and indeed Boris Johnson is going to be able to say we're giving you a bigger state. And the Financial Times is saying, oh, well, the left's won the argument on the economy. And on the one hand, that's great. There's been a shift clearly in the kind of the common sense as to what is required to keep the economy going. But it's never really been the business of the left, of socialists, teaching capitalists how to save capitalism. That isn't really supposed to be our job. That's supposed to be the kind of progressive economist's job. What socialists, I think, have argued for historically and should continue to be arguing for today is, it's in the name, the socialization of wealth, mutual collective ownership of our resources, and crucially, democratic control over those resources. I actually think that this question of democracy is going to be the big battle for the left over the coming years, because we might start seeing more state intervention, more dirigist policies, more nationalization. I think the big thing that most people feel is alienated and disempowered in their workplaces, in their communities, within the state, especially if they're, outside of the big cities. There's a huge contingent of people who basically feel like they have no power over their lives. And Marx talked about that sense of alienation and what it means to really have your, just to be exploited, really, and not to be paid a wage in accordance with the value that you're creating for the owners of those things that you're going into work and using every day. It does create a profound sense of alienation and kind of dispossession. So I think that question of democracy, of who's making the decisions, who has the power, who has the wealth, those questions are, I think, going to be really, really central for the left today, not just let's build more railways.
And I think that is what makes Stolen such an important book, because the last 60 or 50 pages of the book is about what I would call the expansion of democracy, the expansion of taking democracy to the next level, and not ending at the gates of the factory, and not ending before the central banks, or just expanding democracy. And when I was growing up, the Social Democrats in Denmark were very keen on this project, economic democracy. They call it, and we were very, very close to actually obtaining it. And it was a matter of technicality, almost like who was going to organize it, who are going to do it, and how were we going to do it. But there was always one problem with this economic democracy, which I still believe in, and which I think is the only way forward. You cannot have democracy if the economy is not democratized. So the problem at the time was that the workers did not, they weren't very keen on this. This was not a very strong demand from the working classes. I'm not saying that they just demanded more televisions or cars, but no, I think they wanted to work a little less and gain a little more and have a little more time on their own. And your socialism is based on the assumption that workers can unite on their interests as workers, and that is their economic interest. How do you see this challenge? Because in my childhood, it became a little ridiculous that you had Marxist intellectuals telling the workers what they ought to fight for. And they found them absolutely ridiculous. Now I think you have more momentum against the oligarchs, more momentum against the filthy rich. And I think this Occupy Wall Street movement has done a lot of good. But still, the problem is that you are suggesting something that is a little alien to a lot of workers. How do you confront that challenge?
So I think there's a real central question there, which is we live in an age without a revolutionary subject. Yes. So historically, you had in various different parts of the world, in most countries, an organized working class that at some points in history looked close to basically being able to overthrow the state, right? And, in some places it actively did. That era is obviously gone. The state is, increasingly if not the biggest, then, one of the biggest powers that most people experience in their lives, as well as, that direct relationship of exploitation between a boss and a worker. You have this, I suppose, oppressive relationship between the state and the working class in its entirety. And I think that is the really critical thing. We are probably past the age of being able to organize a revolutionary subject just around working class men in factories in big cities, which is of course why initially Marx's argument about the centrality of working class struggle to overthrowing capitalism was not about a kind of idealization of labor or what it meant to be a worker. He just thought these people are crammed together. It's in their interests for the system to be different, and they exist in a space and at a time where they are able to coalesce into a group that has a sense of its own self-interest because of the conditions that existed at that time. Today, those conditions don't exist anymore. So it would be, as you say, kind of ridiculous to go into, the average factory, which, especially when we're talking about manufacturing, is more robots than people these days, and say, organize in order to demand a democratization and socialization of the state. Like, people would be like, okay, well, there's, not very many of us. And also, like, what are you talking about? So there is this question as to how to build a much wider coalition of working class people in order to I suppose, really unite the working classes in all its diversity. And that is the thing, I think, that question about diversity, because a lot of the change, the emphasis on democracy as opposed to just socialization, really came in with the 60s, when you had these kind of these protest movements, you had the feminist movement, you had anti-war movements, and all sorts of different social movements ended up cropping up. And there was a big divide on the left, obviously, between the kind of, to use a caricature, the kind of hippie students and the hard-hatted working classes, right? Exactly. And it was a divide, actually, that politicians like Nixon, for example, exploited. Nixon said to the hard-hatted working classes, we're on your side, ignore these hippies who are protesting against Vietnam. And it is something that politicians are still able to do, right? To divide the working classes and say, white working class office worker in North England, you have nothing in common with black Deliveroo driver in London, or with a female care worker in Wales, right? All of these people are working class. And actually, if you look at the composition of the working class, it's increasingly retail, hospitality, hair work, call center work, like low-level clerical work, because so many of those jobs have actually gone in the global north from the manufacturing sector. So when we're talking about politics within the global north, the challenge is really about uniting that diverse constituency. And I think that demand around, I think that's why the democratic demand is so important, because most of those people, yes, they need a pay rise, right? But that is not, I think, the entire conception that they have of politics. When they look at politics, they see, actually, I am in many areas of my life substantially unfree, whether that's in my workplace, whether it's in my community, whether it's, trying to grapple with this oppressive state apparatus, whatever. I am substantially unfree, and no one's listening to me and no one cares about me. My life is a struggle in all these different ways, and yet there's no one really out there representing my interests. So bringing together that coalition is, I think, the challenge for the left today. And we haven't actually, other than very briefly during the Corbyn era, seen a successful example of how to do that.
And it's one of the points in the book that we should learn from the Thatcher movement to make a narrative and an electoral base and a social force at the same time. And when I look at the Western culture today, I think even progressives are celebrating celebrities that are filthy rich. Yeah. Beyonce can make a hit about, she's so rich that even her grandchildren will be on Forbes list. And today we have this, Bill Gates is like a climate progressive. He's celebrated like a climate progressive. And my children they're soccer stars, football stars. They're not only billionaires, they're tax evading billionaires. And you see this whole wave of sympathy for, I don't remember what was the name, Meghan Markle, between two kinds of upper classes. And I think there needs to be some kind of cultural revolution is a big word for it. But how do you see this challenge of building this narrative, and where do you see the sources of it? You could definitely point to some things like the movies of Ken Loach, something like that.
So, I mean, what we have absolutely lost, we've had this kind of, I suppose the legacy of the 60s has perhaps been more enduring than the legacy of, the post-war era, right? In the sense that it became quite easy for the neoliberals to co-opt a lot of the language of movements against kind of, patriarchy and white supremacy and all these different things, and then say, okay, well, feminists just want us to make sure that, the top paid CEOs who are women earn the same as the top paid CEOs who are men, right? Yes. And you had, lean in and ridiculous spectacles like when, the CIA tweeting about how it supports Black lives, and, there was an article that was written in the US about how that there was more female CEOs of weapons manufacturers than ever before. And this was supposed to be something that we were all celebrating and finding absolutely amazing. You see it everywhere, whether it's in politics, of women on the right saying, oh, I'm in power, so that's a victory for feminism. Thatcher saying exactly the same thing, even as she perpetuated a pretty horrendous economic model that damaged women very, very badly. What is missing from all of that is obviously the central thing, which is class. Now, it is important to recognize diversity within the working class, but it is also important to recognize that the working class has a coherent set of interests that are directly opposed to elites everywhere, of all colors, genders, whatever. There is always this kind of essential and inherent divide between these two groups. The challenge, of course, is that there are real divides within these groups as well, right? So it becomes easy to slice them up and say, we'll have this group over there and that group over there. And, you see it more in Europe, of course, with religious divides, right? That has been historically the way in which the working class has been divided most successfully in many countries around Europe. But today it is, again, often on the basis of identity. You asked me how we solve it.
Yeah, I know it's a big and unfair question.
I mean, I don't know. Part of it is, you're right, to do with the way that we talk about these things. There was a reason that Jeremy Corbyn came so close to winning power in 2017. He won so many votes, more than the previous several elections in which the Labour had fought on a very different platform. And in the context of what has been a long-term decline in support for the Labour Party, largely because working class voters have just exited the electorate. If you look in the UK, the electorate, basically, ever since 1997, almost every election, more working class people have not voted. And that has really been what's been underlying Labour's decline in popularity. So Corbyn managed to reverse that. He managed to get working class people to re-enter the electorate. He managed to convince young people en masse, like young people were, if only young people had voted, Labour would have won every seat in the country, which is an astonishing statistic, of course. So he managed to mobilise all these different groups of people with this very simple, coherent message, which is there is the many and there are the few. We are the many, they are the few. The few avoid tax, they oppress workers, they undermine their obligations to society, they coat themselves in the language of philanthropy whilst exploiting their workers and doing all sorts of degrading the environment, all these different sorts of things. So that language, that oppositional language, was really, really important in beginning to give a sense of class power in the UK, only for that coalition to be split immediately down the middle by Brexit.
Yeah, I always thought that was a vulnerability for that coalition, Brexit, because I don't think many of the young students would like to be a part of the European Union, and the other part of the coalition didn't want to.
Yeah.
There's a distinction that you make, and I really appreciate that you make it between the socialists who want to replicate the golden age of capitalism, social democracy, and then those who want something new, because that is part of, I think, the wider left momentum, that people actually call themselves proud socialists. I mean, I remember when every time you wanted something, or you started saying, well, I'm not a communist, and I don't support Fidel Castro, and I never supported Ceausescu, and I hate the Soviet Union.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And I think that moral trap is just over. It's over with. So yeah. I'm still delighted when I hear people call themselves democratic socialists. But then when I hear them talk, for instance, when I hear Bernie Sanders talk, I would say, well, that is just Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Yeah.
That is just, is that socialism? Or the friend of the house, Thomas Piketty, when he talks about socialism, it's very, very limited. It's very, very limited. It's a wealth tax, and you say you're very strict that this is not enough. So how do you distinguish between the democratic socialism for a new era and what we could call the nostalgic socialists?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in America, it's a very different context because they have yet to win most of the social democratic gains that were won in Europe in the post-war period. They haven't got universal healthcare. They haven't got paid parental leave. They haven't got holiday pay. They work extraordinarily long hours for extraordinarily low wages. So there is so much there's so much ground to cover for them. I mean, the biggest fight ultimately, I think, for the US left is going to be universal healthcare, because you cannot have a working class movement in which someone's ability to live is tied to their employment, because they're not going to go on strike. They're going to lose their health insurance. Like, it's, you know, an impossible situation. So it's understandable that that is what they're focusing on, but it absolutely isn't enough.
And it doesn't change any power structures in society. Sorry.
Well, I mean, I kind of think that it does, but in an iterative way, in a slow way. And this is the question of kind of, you know, reform or revolution, right? Gramsci would have been posing it to us a very long time ago. Should we demand reforms that will make the lives of working class people better, and in doing so potentially augment their power, or should we reject those reforms and simply demand revolution? Now, for me, I think the biggest question to ask of any proposed reform is, will it increase the power of working people relative to capital? So I think there are a lot of kind of social democratic reforms that would actually do that. So things like removing anti-union laws, which is one of the big things that Biden is actually doing that's quite radical.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think like expanding public services provision does something to increase the power of working people, because it allows you to exit the labor force and to say, we can go on strike and we're not going to die, basically. Like that is, you know, for a lot of people in America, that's basically a big challenge, is that if you try and organize, you will get fired because of the anti-union legislation, and then you will have no health care. And then if you've got an underlying health condition or anything, you could literally be dead. So it's a real disincentive to getting people out there on the streets. So a lot of those reforms are necessary, but they are absolutely not enough, because they are perfectly consistent with a society that is characterized by the ongoing domination of labor by capital. And that is, I think, really what differentiates the socialist understanding of these things, is that we are trying to liberate labor, working people, from capital. This involves, yes, the kind of socialization of wealth, so the transformation of ownership in society. So rather than having a small number of people who own all the stuff and the majority who work for them, you would have a commoning of society's resources, so a collective stewardship of those resources, whether we're talking about, you know, infrastructure, public services, the means of production, all of these different things. But also it is, again, about everyone making decisions together. And this, I think, is increasingly the kind of big linchpin, as I was saying. It's not simply enough to say we are going to nationalize the railways, or we're going to, you know, expand public services. You have to be able to say how this is going to make a difference to ordinary people, how it's going to augment their power, and how it's going to answer this challenge that I don't have a voice. I think that is really, you know, I speak to people about this all the time. One thing that keeps coming up over and over and over again, people say politicians are all the same. They don't listen to people like me. There's no point turning out to vote because I can't change anything. People are really convinced that nothing that they can do matters. I think that is actually the biggest challenge that the left faces today, is just this sense among so many working class people that there's nothing that they could do to change the circumstances in which they live. And in that sense, any victory, no matter how small, that you're involved in, changes your conception of the world. Even if it's literally stopping your local library from being closed. You're like, I organized with a movement and I made a difference. Maybe I could do that in a bigger scale, which is why I kind of think the policy stuff is extremely important, and it is mobilizing and it supports the emergence of this movement. But what's also really, really important is getting people active on the ground. That could be anything from joining a union, of course, which is really important, to joining a political party, to literally doing something like supporting your community through these mutual aid societies that have emerged during the pandemic, or protesting against, as I said, the closure of some public services or your local library. Just getting out on the street and being around other people who also want to change the world, and realizing that you are not alone, that you're part of this movement, and this movement is big and it's powerful. And if it realized its own power, that would be a real threat to the establishment.
And I think actually it is quite hopeful to see Joe Biden siding with workers, and it is quite hopeful the way he talks about unions. And, you know, we see mobilizations, you know, have expected that they would have the courage to take the fight in Alabama. And from now on, Democratic politicians in America, they've been very favorable to big tech and the new industries. That will be more difficult for them. But this whole, I think another basic challenge for democratic socialism today is that it's within the context of climate change. So normally I would think that you could have crisis for some years. You could break down some institutions and develop new institutions. But we know for every year where we keep emitting as much as we do now, half of that will stay in the atmosphere for 100 years. So climate change makes me a bit conservative about institutions, that we need to get maximum decision efficiency out of the institutions. And I think for the left, that is also a dilemma, because I was used to being against trade agreements, the European Central Bank, the WTO, IMF, the World Bank, all these institutions that proved enormously efficient at implementing neoliberalism. And I think that we must think of them as agents that can help us prevent climate change. And that is I think that is a delicate dilemma. Did you understand what I was saying, and how do you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a danger for the left recently is that there has been this idea that there's no way of tackling climate breakdown within capitalism. I don't think that's right, because I think there already will be elites within the capitalist world system coming up with mechanisms to start to tackle climate breakdown, but which are fundamentally based on maintaining existing and actually exacerbating existing inequality between labor and capital, but also between different parts of the world. This is the really big challenge that we're going to face, is that if we have the kind of status quo approach to tackling climate breakdown, leaders in the global north will say, we'll decarbonize maybe by 2050, right? By that point, you've already reached a lot of those tipping points where you start to see really catastrophic changes in the way that the biosphere works, and the way that the entire, all of ecology on the planet works. And that is disproportionately going to affect the global south. It's already with the global south, whether you're talking about desertification in the Sahel, whether you're talking about, extreme weather events in the US and various other parts of the world, whether you're talking about, declining food yields. So, there's a real challenge here, and to us just be able to feed ourselves as the world gets hotter, whether you're talking about ocean levels rising for low-lying nations and island nations in the Caribbean as well. All of these things are, a couple of places in the global north that are, like the Netherlands and the west coast of the US, disproportionately likely to affect the billions of people who live in the global south. And as we're seeing at the moment in India, our politicians are basically perfectly content to say millions of people can die as long as we'll protect our own, as long as we protect our own and we protect our profits. But of course, it's completely self-defeating, because unless the virus is eradicated in India, it's going to continue spreading around the world. And unless India returns to growth, the world economy isn't likely to return to growth. Equally, if we have climate breakdown that affects the global south, we'll have mass migration into the global north. And there's not going to be any way of stopping that. No matter how many kind of eco-fascist Marine Le Pen say the big challenge of our age is going to be, strengthening Fortress Europe, you're just not going to be able to stop those millions of people moving, because their homes will be underwater, right? So there is just a real kind of concern here that, yes, our politicians are increasingly looking to try to decarbonize their economies and try to reach net zero and to implement all these reforms that allow us to get to a form of green growth, if that's possible. But what we're not looking at is what implications this will have for inequality. And that's, again, true at the international level. It's also true at the domestic level, as you saw in France with the yellow vests, with the gilets jaunes. So I think the left really needs to be in these discussions and in these debates, raising these points and saying there is no solution to climate breakdown. That is not a global solution. There is no solution to climate breakdown that does not tackle imperialism and extraction and exploitation There is no solution to climate breakdown that simply involves imposing a carbon tax that's disproportionately likely to hurt the working classes. What we're really facing as we look down the barrel of the gun of climate breakdown is a crisis of capitalism. It's a crisis in the legitimacy of capitalism. It's a crisis in the very functioning of capitalism. And elites are going to try to fix that whilst keeping everything else the same. The left has to be there saying, things cannot stay the same. We need to use this moment, and actually this pandemic as well. We need to make sure that we use the recovery from the pandemic to decarbonize, reduce inequality, and actually just waive intellectual property rights so that millions of Indian people aren't dying and they can access the vaccine technology that they need for the entire economy to get back to growth. It's profoundly short-sighted for us to be behaving in a way which is to say, we'll just emit as much as we want, we'll keep our intellectual property, we will not have any debt write-off for the global south, because they're the people who produce everything that we literally use to survive.
Even the vaccines are produced in India, exactly. Which is the most ridiculous paradox. Well, time is running out, unfortunately, but I have one last question for you. And I think something that makes Stolen a very, very strong book is that it deals with financialization fundamentally. And that also shows it's a new generation. It's a generation that wasn't shaped by the thinking of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And I was thinking, what would be your first 2 or 3 demands on your first day in office as a democratic socialist leader of your country? And I think, I think that's a real strength of your book. And there's a lot of moral mobilization going on. I think they should read your book and get some slogans out of it. So what would be your first 2 or 3 initiatives?
Right. So 1, remove anti-trade union legislation, empower the trade union movement. 2, implement a wide-ranging Green New Deal that involved decarbonization, jobs creation, infrastructure investment, and nationalization of key parts of the energy and transport infrastructure. 3, renationalize the central bank and use it to support those policies that I outline in that book. So things like a national infrastructure bank, a people's asset manager, those kinds of big transformations in ownership. And actually the biggest challenge that we have, particularly in the UK and the US at the moment, is central banks creating tons and tons of money, pumping it into the financial system, pushing up equity prices, pushing up house prices, massively exacerbating inequality. And that we need to put to an end. I think we have to do it by renationalizing the central bank.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. And thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege talking to you. Thank you for taking your time, and we will continue to follow your work and let us inspired by what you do and how you think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that when my next book comes out next year, I'll be able to come and speak to you in person.
Thank you. We'll invite you, that's for sure. Have a
Lovely.
good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.